The fork hovered halfway to my mouth when Christopher's words landed heavy and deliberate. "Mom, you're too old to control your own money." At first I thought I'd misheard him, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of my grandchildren in the next room. But then Rachel's polite smile told me I hadn't. A ripple of chuckles moved around the table, soft enough to pretend it was harmless, sharp enough to cut. I felt the years I'd worked saved and built my life shrink in their eyes to a single word old. In that moment I realized they weren't here to share a meal. They were here to decide my future without me. The smell of rosemary and roasted chicken filled my kitchen, a scent I'd perfected over the years, to draw everyone to the table. I moved between the stove and the counter, sliding the roasted potatoes onto a platter while keeping an ear on the muffled laughter coming from the living room. My sons Christopher and Daniel were home for Sunday lunch, something we hadn't managed in months. Both had brought their wives and kids, and the house felt full in that familiar, chaotic way. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and carried the last dish into the dining room. The sunlight poured through the bay window, falling on the polished oak table I'd had since before Christopher was born. As everyone settled into their chairs, the usual hum of small talk started up. Emily chatting about her new project at work, the twins whispering to each other about something on their phones, Sophie asking if she could pass the salad bowl. Daniel kept his eyes on his plate, methodically slicing into his chicken, as if the conversation had nothing to do with him. But Sophie, his wife, chimed in. "We've been talking about how important it is to plan ahead, maybe look into assisted living before it's urgent. That way it's your choice, before something happens." Something happened. The phrase twisted in my stomach. I set down my fork carefully, the tines ringing softly against the plate, and looked at each of them in turn. My sons, my daughters-in-law, all seated around the table I'd worked my whole life to keep. The air felt heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe, or entitlement, dressed up as concern. I could feel Emily's eyes on me from across the table, her brow furrowed slightly. She said nothing, and neither did the twins, their attention already drifting back to their phones. Rachel reached for her water glass, adding, "It's not that we think you can't manage things, it's just, the world is more complicated now. Investments, taxes, healthcare costs. You've done amazingly, but maybe it's time to let the younger generation handle it." The younger generation? As if I hadn't been balancing books and negotiating with banks while they were still learning to drive. I took a slow breath, willing my pulse to calm. Losing my temper now would give them exactly the picture they were painting, a woman slipping incapable of making rational decisions. Instead, I reached for the bread basket, passed it to Sophie, and listened. Christopher cleared his throat, clearly relishing the role he'd taken on. "We've been thinking about your future, Mom, about what happens if you can't keep up with everything. It's better to make these decisions now while you're still healthy." Rachel nodded along, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "We could make sure everything is in order. Bank accounts, the house, your retirement funds. It would take the burden off you." I looked down at my plate, the chicken cooling in front of me, and forced my voice to stay even. And who exactly would be handling all that? Christopher's smile widened just enough to show a flash of teeth. "Well, Daniel and I could work together. Between the two of us, we could keep everything running smoothly. You'd have nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. Except the fact that they were talking about my life as if I weren't sitting right there," Sophie added softly. "We've even looked into some places in Lake Oswego. Really lovely facilities. They have wait lists, so it's smart to think ahead." A bead of sweat slid down my spine, though the room wasn't warm. I realized then this wasn't an offhand comment or a sudden idea. They'd planned this, talked about it without me maybe even agreed on the script. Over my own Sunday lunch, I pushed a piece of potato around my plate, letting the silence stretch until it was almost uncomfortable. Then I smiled. Small, controlled, the way you do when you're deciding whether to call someone out or wait for the right moment. "I appreciate your interest," I said. "It's always good to know my family is thinking about me." Daniel finally glanced up, his expression unreadable, but he didn't speak. Christopher, perhaps sensing my restraint, leaned back and took a sip of his wine as if he'd just wrapped up a successful meeting. I made a note in my mind, the kind I used to make when reconciling ledgers, precise, unemotional. Today, I'd learned something valuable. My own children were drawing up plans for my future, and I wasn't invited to the table. Not really. I passed the salad dressing to Emily, who accepted it quietly, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. School schedules, Daniel's new project at work, Rachel's latest design client. But underneath it all, I could still feel the weight of what had been said pressing down on the edges of my smile. As I refilled water glasses and cleared plates, their laughter rose and fell in the background. I kept moving, nodding at the right moments, all the while filing away each remark, each glance exchanged between them. By the time dessert came out, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When the last coffee cup was rinsed and the dishwasher hummed in the kitchen, I slipped away under the pretense of putting away linens. My office was at the back of the house, the one room that still felt entirely mine. I closed the door until it latched, softly shutting out the muted voices from the living room. Sitting at my desk, I let the quiet settle in. My eyes drifted to the file cabinet in the corner, then to the small fireproof safe tucked behind it. That safe had been with me for decades, holding the story of my life in tidy, numbered folders. Lately, I'd noticed the way Rachel's questions had shifted. They used to be about recipes or paint colors. Now they were about account balances, interest rates, whether I had looked into consolidating my retirement funds. Casual on the surface, probing underneath, Christopher had been more direct. Last month, while we were clearing leaves in the backyard, he'd suggested putting his name on my main checking account just in case something happened. He'd smiled as if it were a courtesy, a favor to me. I'd smiled back, hiding the steel in my spine. Even Daniel, usually the quiet one, had asked if my life insurance policy was up to date. He'd done it over the phone almost offhand, but I knew better than to believe in coincidence. I stood crossed to the safe and spun the combination without hesitation. The door swung open, and the familiar scent of paper and metal greeted me. I reached in and pulled out a thin folder labeled Current. Inside were the recent bank statements, investment summaries, and the title to the house. I flipped through each page slowly, the numbers grounding me in a way no conversation could. Every cent was where I had put it. Every document was in my name alone. The house bought in 1990 for $280,000 was fully mine. No liens, no second mortgages. The brokerage account showed steady growth from my investments in renewable energy stocks and a carefully balanced index fund. I traced my finger over the embossed seal on the property title and felt the corner of my mouth lift. They thought they were planning ahead, but they had no idea how far ahead I'd been planning all along. Carefully, I returned the documents to the folder and slid it back into place. The satisfying click of the safe door closing felt like sealing a promise to myself. I locked it and tucked the key back into its hiding spot, a hollowed-out book on the third shelf, a trick I'd learned from my father. I turned back to my desk, pulling out a yellow legal pad. At the top, I wrote in neat block letters, Options. Underneath, I listed everything that came to mind. Selling the house, moving somewhere new, shifting funds into accounts they couldn't access, retitling assets. Each idea felt like a small stone placed in a wall I was building, one they wouldn't see until it was finished. The murmur of voices outside grew louder, punctuated by a burst of laughter. I pictured them on my sofa, cups in hand, maybe already talking about how reasonable I'd been during lunch, how easy it would be to guide me into their plan. I slid the notepad into the top drawer, leaving it slightly ajar so I'd remember to return to it tonight. For now, I needed to rejoin them to keep the performance going. I straightened my cardigan, smoothed my hair, and opened the door. The smell of coffee drifted down the hall, warm and familiar. I walked back into the living room to find Christopher standing near the fireplace, swirling the last sip of wine in his glass. Rachel was showing Sophie photos of a remodel she'd done for a client in Lake Oswego. Daniel looked up briefly when I entered, then dropped his gaze. "You should see this kitchen, Mom," Rachel called. "All open shelving, so airy. We could do something like that here. Make things easier to reach for you." Easier to reach? I smiled politely and moved to the armchair by the window. "It's lovely," I said. "Maybe someday." Christopher checked his watch. We should get going soon. Big week ahead. They gathered their things, hugs and goodbyes passed around like business cards. I walked them to the door, watching as they crossed the driveway to their cars. Rachel's hand was looped through Christopher's arm, their heads close together. Sophie was saying something to Daniel, who nodded without looking back at me. When the engines started and the taillights disappeared down the street, I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment. The house was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet I loved. This was the quiet of an empty stage after a performance, the air still charged with what had just played out. I went back to my office, opened the drawer, and took out the legal pad. Under options, I added one more line in firm, steady handwriting: decide on next move. The decision didn't have to be today, but it would be soon. The next morning, I made coffee the way I always did. French press, 4 minutes steeping. But my hands moved on their own. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the looks on their faces yesterday. The mix of pity and calculation had lit a fuse I hadn't realized was there. I sat at the kitchen table, cradling my mug, and stared out at the maple tree in the backyard. 33 years I'd looked at that tree through these windows. I'd watched it turn gold in the fall, lose every leaf to winter storms, then bud out again in spring. I'd imagined I'd see it until the day I couldn't get down the stairs anymore. But now the thought of staying here until that day felt like giving them exactly what they expected, roots they could dig up when it suited them. I didn't finish my coffee. Instead, I walked to the hallway closet, pulled out the box with my old leather address book, and flipped to M. The number was still there, written in my careful, slanted hand: Linda Marks, real estate broker. Linda had sold this house to Robert and me in the summer of 1990, when Christopher was 9 and Daniel was 6. She'd been in the business long enough to know every street, every buyer with cash in hand. I dialed before I could overthink it. "Margaret Hayes," she said warmly when I gave my name. "It's been a long time." "It has," I agreed. "Linda, I'm thinking of selling the house." There was a beat of silence, then, "Are you serious?" "Serious enough to ask you how fast you can get it listed." Linda didn't waste time. "With your neighborhood and that lot, I have 3 buyers I could call today who'd give you a solid offer, maybe above asking." I felt the corner of my mouth turn up. "I'm not looking to drag it out." By Thursday, the first buyer had walked through, so. A week later, I was signing a purchase agreement for $950,000 no contingencies cash offer. The inspection was waived and the closing date was set 3 weeks out. It all moved so quickly I almost felt dizzy, but it was the good kind of dizzy, the way you feel when you're the one pulling the strings. I didn't tell Christopher. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell anyone. Every document came straight to my personal email. Every check went directly into an account. Neither of them knew existed. That same account had been my quiet project for years, seeded with the $42,000 I'd inherited from my father, grown carefully through disciplined investing. Now, with the house proceeds, the balance was something that could carry me for the rest of my life. In between calls with Linda and signing papers, I started scrolling through listings. I wanted something smaller, easier to keep, but not a condo or anything that tied me to an HOA. My heart kept drifting to the coast. Astoria had always been a favorite. Historic, artsy, close enough for friends to visit, but far enough to feel like a clean break. One rainy afternoon, I found it a cedar-shingled cottage with white trim perched on a bluff with a view of the Columbia River meeting the Pacific. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a little garden in the back. Asking price $580, $1,000. I called the agent that evening. "You'll want to see it in person," she said. "I'll take it," I replied. A pause. "You haven't even—" "I'll take it. Cash offer, full price." 2 days later, the contract was in my inbox. The funds from the house sale would cover it easily, leaving me with $370, $1,000 to shift into a new portfolio, half into municipal bonds, half into a mix of index funds and dividend-paying stocks. I ran the numbers twice, then a third time out of habit, but I didn't need to. I knew what I was doing. I kept my days looking ordinary on the surface. Grocery runs, phone calls with Eleanor, coffee dates with Patricia when she was in town. But under the surface, everything was in motion. The movers were booked, the cottage keys would be in my hand the Monday after closing, and every decision had been made without a single whisper to the people who thought they were entitled to make them for me. One evening, as the sun set behind the maple tree, I stood at the kitchen sink and let my eyes trace the familiar outlines of the yard. I thought about Robert sanding the porch rail, about the boys playing tag in the grass, about all the Thanksgivings and birthdays and summer barbecues. And then I thought about Christopher's voice, so certain I couldn't be trusted with my own life. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and left the kitchen. The house was already starting to feel less like mine and more like a chapter I'd decided to close. Exactly a week later, I invited everyone back for dinner. I made pot roast with root vegetables, the kind Christopher always bragged to his co-workers about, and a homemade apple pie for dessert. Everything looked and smelled just as it used to, like the dinners I used to host when the boys were little, only this time there was something different simmering under the surface. I set the table with the good china, the one they all thought I kept for holidays. Rachel commented on it as soon as she walked in. "Fancy tonight?" she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just felt like it," I replied, ushering them to the living room while I brought out drinks. Daniel accepted a beer. Christopher took a glass of wine without looking at me much, already scanning the room as if it were a property listing he was evaluating. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Conversation revolved around Emily's upcoming presentation at work, Sophie's latest volunteer project, and the twins' soccer games. I let the chatter flow, nodding at the right moments, keeping my own thoughts to myself. When the plates were nearly clean and I'd just refilled Christopher's wine, I excused myself for a moment. I went to my office, opened the drawer where I'd placed the folder earlier that afternoon, and ran my hand over the crisp manila cover. Inside were carefully chosen documents, not everything but enough. I'd pulled recent investment summaries, a bank statement from my private account, and front and center the signed purchase and sale agreement for the house. When I returned, I didn't sit right away. Instead, I set the folder in the center of the table between the half-empty dishes and the salt shaker. Christopher looked at it first, then at me. "What's this?" I smiled, calm and deliberate. "If you and Daniel want to manage my money, these are the things you'd be responsible for." The room went still. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his brow knitting, while Rachel shifted in her chair. Sophie glanced at her husband, then back at me as if waiting for a cue. Christopher reached out and opened the folder. His eyes skimmed over the first page. A list of my current holdings, each with tidy numbers in black ink. He flipped to the next, a bank statement showing deposits and balances well above what I knew they assumed I had. Then the agreement for the house sale, the ink still fresh, my signature bold at the bottom. "Wait," Daniel said quietly. "You sold the house." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence do its work. Rachel's hand twitched toward her wineglass. Sophie coughed softly. "Everything here," I said, "finally is in my name. Under my control. And it's staying that way." Rachel tried for a light laugh. "We were just trying to help Margaret." "No one's saying you can't." "You were saying exactly that," I cut in, still keeping my tone even. "At lunch last week, you all made it very clear you'd already been talking about how to manage my affairs. So I thought it was only fair to show you what that would actually involve." Christopher's expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes, a crack in the confident mask he'd worn last week. "This isn't what we—" "It's exactly what you meant," I said, leaning back in my chair. "And now you've seen it. You've seen that I'm not some frail woman who needs her children to make decisions for her." No one spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I could see the calculations running in Christopher's mind, the way his gaze lingered on the sale price in the agreement, on the account balance, that proved I was far from struggling. I closed the folder and slid it back toward me. "That's all for tonight," I said, as if we'd just finished reviewing a recipe. Rachel pressed her lips together. Sophie stared at her napkin. Daniel glanced at me, then at his brother before settling back in his chair. The pot roast had gone cold, the pie untouched. I stood gathering plates and carried them to the kitchen without another word. From there, I could hear the low murmur of voices too soft to catch. When I returned, Christopher's wineglass was empty and his posture had changed. Less certain, more guarded. He didn't meet my eyes when they said goodnight. I watched from the doorway as they walked down the path to their cars, the cool night air carrying their muffled conversation away. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the ground under my feet was entirely my own. I stepped back inside, letting the door click shut behind me. The folder still sat on the buffet, its contents neatly tucked away, but my fingers itched to place one last card on the table, one that would make my position impossible to ignore. They were still gathering coats and handbags when I returned to the dining room. "Before you all head out," I said evenly, "there's something else you should know." Rachel glanced up, her polite smile ready, but it faltered when I spoke the next words. "I've sold this house." It landed like a dropped glass. Instant stillness, every eye fixed on me. Christopher was the first to recover, though his voice cracked as he said, "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" "I signed the sale agreement 2 weeks ago." I replied, my tone calm, deliberate. "Closing is in a few days. I'll be moving out next month." Daniel's eyebrows shot up, and for once he looked straight at me instead of his plate. "You're moving? Where?" "That's not something I'm ready to share yet," I said, keeping my gaze steady. "What matters is it's my decision. This property has been mine for over 30 years, and I've decided it's time to turn the page." Sophie shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Daniel, who was clearly trying to read my face for any sign I might change my mind. Rachel let out a thin laugh that didn't match her eyes. "Well, that's certainly a surprise." "It shouldn't be," I said, still in that same measured voice. "You've made it very clear you think I can't manage my own affairs. I thought I'd save you the trouble of worrying about this particular asset." Christopher's mouth opened, then closed again. His knuckles whitened on the back of his chair. "This house," he started, then stopped. I could see the thought flicker in his eyes, the one he didn't want to say out loud, the inheritance he'd assumed was his. "It's my home," I said quietly but firmly. "And my choice. I've made arrangements that work for me. That's all you need to know." The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Christopher swallowed hard, the fight draining from his expression, replaced by something almost like disbelief. Daniel leaned back, arms crossed, but I caught the flicker of worry there too. Maybe about what else I might decide to sell, or how far I might go to keep my independence. Rachel busied herself with straightening her bag strap, avoiding my gaze. Sophie gave a small, awkward smile that didn't reach her eyes. I stepped back from the table, signaling the conversation was over. "Drive safe," I said simply. Christopher finally muttered, "Yeah, sure." His voice was lower now, stripped of the confidence he'd had when he'd walked in tonight. They left without another word, their footsteps echoing down the walkway. I stood by the window as they got into their cars, watching the taillights disappear into the night. For the first time in years, I felt a strange lightness in my chest. Not joy exactly, but relief. The kind that comes from knowing you've taken a piece of your life firmly back into your own hands. 2 weeks later, I was unlocking the front door of my cottage in Astoria. The salty air rolled in before I even stepped inside, carrying the cry of gulls and the faint scent of kelp. The little cedar-shingled house sat just far enough back from the bluff to feel safe, but close enough that the rhythm of the tide became the background to every thought. The living room was small but bright, with windows that framed the Pacific like a painting. There was a compact kitchen tucked into the corner, a narrow staircase leading up to a loft bedroom, and a tiny garden in the back, where a single rosebush bloomed stubbornly in the chilly wind. On my second day, a knock came at the door. I opened it to find a woman in her early 70s with short, silver hair holding a plate of still warm scones. "Patricia Grant," she said, offering her hand. "I live next door. Figured I'd better introduce myself before the rumors start." Her grip was firm, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. I liked her instantly. Within an hour, we were sitting at my kitchen table, the scones between us, trading the condensed versions of our life stories. Patricia had been a professor of economics at the University of Washington before retiring to the coast. She missed the energy of teaching, she said, but not the bureaucracy. When I mentioned my years as a CPA, she smiled. Once a numbers person, always a numbers person? You'll see. You can take the woman out of the market, but you can't take the market out of the woman. She wasn't wrong. That evening, I found myself scrolling through stock tickers and municipal bond rates, not out of obligation, but curiosity. It felt good to engage that part of my brain again, the part that thrived on patterns and probabilities. A few days later, Eleanor drove in from Eugene. She'd been my friend since our kids were in grade school, the kind of friend who never needed a reason to show up. She brought a stack of novels, a jar of her homemade peach jam, and a look in her eye that told me she knew exactly why I'd left Portland. "You did the right thing," she said over dinner. "Sometimes you have to step away for people to see you clearly." We spent the next morning walking the beach, letting the cold surf chase our boots. I felt lighter with her there, like I'd been carrying something heavy and only just set it down. Back at the cottage, my phone buzzed. 3 messages from Christopher. "Mom, I'm worried you rushed into this. Are you sure you're thinking long-term? Call me. We can talk through your options." I read them all, set the phone down, and poured myself another cup of tea. There was nothing in his words I hadn't heard before, and nothing I felt compelled to answer. That night, Patricia came by with a bottle of Pinot Noir. We sat at my dining table with my laptop open, comparing notes on energy sector ETFs and the latest job reports. It wasn't work, not exactly, but it stirred something in me. A reminder that my life was still mine to shape and my decisions didn't need anyone else's permission. By the time I closed the curtains and turned out the lights, the wind had picked up outside, rattling the shingles. I stood at the window for a long moment, watching the dark water shift and swell. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I wanted to be, and the rest of the world could wait. 3 days later, a silver hatchback pulled up in front of my cottage. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I opened the door and saw Emily standing there, wind-blown hair, nervous smile, I felt a jolt of surprise. "Hi, Grandma," she said, holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Can I come in?" "Of course," I replied, stepping aside. She set the bag on the counter, still warm muffins from the bakery downtown, and took off her coat. We sat at the kitchen table, the sea muttering softly outside. Emily wrapped her hands around her mug, eyes fixed on the steam before she spoke. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for not saying anything at that lunch in Portland. I didn't know how to speak up without making things worse." I reached across the table, resting my hand lightly on hers. "You don't owe me an apology for that. You saw how it was." She nodded, then gave a small smile. "I am proud of you, though, for standing your ground. Dad's not saying it, but I know he's been stewing." Her candor caught me off guard, but it warmed me too. Emily had always had a straightforward streak. We talked for a while about her work at Brightwave Digital, a scrappy marketing startup in Portland. Then her tone shifted. "I think I want to leave. I've been toying with the idea of starting my own company. Something that focuses on sustainable branding for small businesses. Green marketing, I don't know where to start." I leaned back, letting her words settle. "Do you have a plan? Not just for the creative side, but the financial side?" She shook her head. "Not yet. That's the part that scares me." "That's the part I can help with," I said. "If you're serious, we can map it out together. Budget funding options, even projections for the first 2 years. Her eyes lit up. "You'd do that with me." "Of course, but you'll have to be ready for some tough questions and you'll have to do the work." "I can do that," she said quickly, almost eagerly. I pulled a legal pad from the counter and set it between us. "First thing, what's your end goal? Are you trying to make this a boutique firm or something scalable?" We spent the next hour scribbling notes, outlining possible services, thinking about target clients. Emily's ideas were fresh, but I could see where she needed structure. She listened intently when I explained cash flow versus profit, why she'd need a cushion before quitting her current job, and how to pitch to investors without giving away too much equity. Every time she grasped a concept, she grinned like she'd just unlocked a puzzle. It was contagious. I found myself as energized as she was. When we finally set the pen down, the table was covered in diagrams and bullet points. Emily leaned back, exhaling. "This is... wow. I feel like I can actually do this now." I smiled. "You can. And you should. But remember, success isn't just about the money. It's about building something you're proud of, something that lasts." Her expression softened. "That's what I want. Something real, not just chasing numbers." As I cleared the mugs and stacked the papers, I felt something shift inside me. For all the ugliness with Christopher and Daniel here was the proof that not everything in the next generation was lost. Standing at the sink, I glanced at Emily now, gathering her notes into neat stacks. This wasn't about leaving a house or a bank account behind. It was about passing down something far more valuable, the tools to stand on your own, to protect what you build, and to make your own choices. And from the look in her eyes, Emily was ready to take it all in. The next week settled into an easy rhythm. Mornings often began with Patricia dropping by, coffee mugs in hand, to talk through the latest market reports. She had a way of dissecting economic news that made me see patterns I'd missed, and I found myself enjoying the back and forth more than I expected. Sometimes we'd trade book recommendations, everything from investment memoirs to historical biographies. Eleanor came for a long weekend, bringing her usual whirlwind energy. We spread travel brochures across the dining table, circling spots along the Oregon coast and in the San Juan Islands. 3 days here, 4 days there, she said, mapping out a route like she was planning a treasure hunt. The thought of traveling again without having to answer to anyone lit something in me I hadn't felt in years. In between these moments, I carved out time for Emily. We met twice that week over video calls, poring over loan options for her startup. I explained the difference between a small business line of credit and an SBA loan and why she should be cautious about investor terms that seemed too generous. She absorbed it all, asking sharp questions, her notebook filling page after page. It felt good. No, it felt right, to use my skills for someone who genuinely valued them. Then there were Christopher's messages. At first they came every few days. "Mom, you really should have talked to us before making such big changes. I just don't want you to regret acting on impulse. This isn't how family should work." A few had softer edges. "Hope you're settling in okay. Do you need help with anything?" But even those carried a weight I recognized, the kind of concern that was less about me and more about maintaining a foothold in my decisions. One afternoon, after receiving 3 messages in a row, I set the phone down and stared out at the garden. Patricia's voice from a few days earlier came back to me. "There's a difference between care and control. You can feel it if you listen closely enough." She was right. I could feel it now in every word Christopher sent. The subtle pressure, the expectation that I'd justify myself. I didn't reply. That evening I sat with Patricia on her porch, watching the sky turn the color of apricots as the sun dipped toward the horizon. "You've been quiet," she noted. "Just thinking," I said, "about how some people love you best when you're easy to manage." She raised her glass. "Then, here's to being unmanageable." We laughed, the sound mingling with the crash of the waves below. As the air cooled and the first stars appeared, I realized I wasn't just building a new routine here in Astoria. I was building a new version of myself. One who knew exactly which voices to invite in and which to let fade into the background. 2 mornings later, I spotted a familiar sedan pulling up along the curb. Daniel stepped out holding a pie tin wrapped in foil. The smell of cinnamon reached me before he even made it up the path. "Apple," he said, offering the pie like a peace treaty. "Your favorite—" I took it, gesturing him inside. "Coffee." "Please," he replied, slipping off his jacket and glancing around the cottage. "Nice place, Mom. Cozy." We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from our mugs. For a few moments we talked about small things. The drive from Portland, the weather, his kids' school projects. But I could feel something heavier waiting in the air between us. Finally, he sighed. I owe you an apology. Back at that lunch, I just went along with Chris's plan. I didn't stop to think how it would feel for you to have us talking over your life like that. I should have spoken up. I met his gaze, letting the silence stretch a moment before answering. Yes, you should have. But I'm glad you came here to say it. He nodded, shoulders loosening slightly. I wasn't trying to disrespect you. I guess I thought, if Chris handled things, it would take some weight off you. Daniel, I said, my voice steady, you're my son. That's the role I want you to fill when you visit me. Not a supervisor, not a guardian, just my son. His eyes softened and he leaned back in his chair. I hear you, and I promise, I'll respect your decisions from now on. I worry Chris won't. He's not great at letting go of an idea once he's locked onto it. I cut a slice of pie, setting it in front of him. That's his problem to work through, not mine, and not yours. He smiled faintly, picking up his fork. Still, I'll keep an eye out. I don't want this turning into some endless tug of war. Neither do I said. We spent the next hour in easier conversation, sharing family updates, swapping stories about the kids when they were little. It felt almost like old times before the tension over money and control had crept in. When he finally stood to leave, Daniel hugged me tightly. I mean it, Mom. I'll respect the boundaries. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it. I watched from the porch as he drove away, the pie tin empty on the counter behind me, and a sense of cautious optimism settling in my chest. For the first time in months, one of those strained lines between me and my sons felt just a little less frayed. By mid-December, the invitations for Christmas had begun. Christopher called first, suggesting, no insisting, that I come to Portland for dinner at Rachel's parents' house. I told him I had other plans. When he pressed, I simply said I'm spending the holiday here in Astoria this year and left it at that. Instead, I extended my own invitations to Patricia, to Eleanor, to Daniel and Emily. They all accepted with enthusiasm. On Christmas Eve morning, the cottage smelled of cinnamon rolls and fresh pine. Daniel arrived early with bags of groceries, and before long Eleanor was in my kitchen kneading bread dough while Patricia basted a roast. Emily floated between us, stringing garlands over the mantel and laughing when the pine cones kept slipping loose. We cooked together, telling old stories, trading recipes, and pausing now and then to step onto the porch and breathe in the cold, salty air. The sky stayed a soft winter gray, but inside everything felt bright. Over lunch, Emily cleared her throat. So, I have news. I turned in my resignation at Brightwave last week. A cheer went up around the table. Daniel clapped her on the back. Eleanor grinned and Patricia raised her glass. I've got the first stages of the business plan drafted. Emily continued. Grandma's been helping me and I'm hoping to launch by late spring. I watched her eyes shine as she spoke, pride swelling in my chest. This was the kind of legacy worth leaving. Later, as we were plating dessert, my phone buzzed. A text from Christopher lit the screen. Mom, I can't believe you'd skip Christmas with your family for whatever this is. Attached was a photo, a large gift basket sitting on a polished kitchen counter. When it arrived an hour later, dropped off by a courier, I recognized it immediately. An assortment of things I had never liked. Bitter dark chocolates, a brand of coffee I'd once mentioned gave me heartburn, and a jar of spicy pickles I'd pushed away at his house years ago. Patricia caught my eye as I unpacked it, her brow arching just slightly. Daniel frowned. Emily gave a short, incredulous laugh. Well, Eleanor said dryly, it's the thought that counts. Or at least some kind of thought. I set the basket aside, letting the conversation drift back to lighter topics. Outside the wind was picking up, but in my little cottage, surrounded by people who chose to be here, the warmth held steady. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. This time there was no pretense of civility. Mom, you're destroying this family. Come home. I read it twice, feeling that familiar twinge of exhaustion behind my eyes. The phrasing was telling. Come home. As if the place I had built for myself wasn't real, as if my worth existed only in proximity to their expectations. I set the phone on the counter, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window. The ocean was restless today, waves pounding against the rocks like a drumbeat. When I picked up the phone again, my fingers moved without hesitation. "Christmas will still happen," I typed, "but you'll be responsible for everything I've always done. I hope you realize the value of it." I read it once, not changing a word, then hit send. I didn't wait for his reply. I placed the phone face down, the quiet of the room settling around me like a blanket. For years I'd been caught in a cycle, giving smoothing over every rough edge in the name of family harmony. But harmony built on being diminished isn't peace. The coffee cooled beside me as I sat back listening to the wind rattle the eaves. There was a strange lightness in my chest, the kind that comes when you stop bracing for the next blow. In the kitchen, Eleanor and Patricia were already chattering about breakfast. Daniel's laugh carrying from the porch. Emily's voice joined in warm and bright. I slid the phone into a drawer and walked toward the sound. Whatever came next, I knew this much: the loop was closed, and I wasn't stepping back into it. The days after Christmas passed in a quiet rhythm that suited me. Mornings were for coffee by the window, the sea air carrying a chill that woke me better than any alarm. Emily came by often, her laptop under one arm, a stack of notebooks under the other. We'd spread her papers across my dining table, refining her business plan line by line. She had a sharp mind for marketing and a deep passion for her environmental mission, but I could see where the numbers needed to tighten, where the forecasts had to be more realistic. We talked about cash flow, about securing suppliers who shared her values, about protecting her ownership when investors came calling. Watching her confidence grow was like watching a flower open in slow motion. Steady, deliberate, and certain. Daniel called every few days sometimes to check in, sometimes just to share a joke he thought I'd appreciate. One Saturday, he drove down again, this time with his kids in tow. We spent the afternoon on the beach collecting shells, the children running ahead, their laughter snatched by the wind. Eleanor and Patricia remained my anchors in town. Patricia still popped over with market news and investment insights, Eleanor with her endless stream of travel ideas and books to swap. They never treated me like I was fragile, never made me feel like my worth had an expiration date. One evening in early January, Emily and I sat side by side comparing her updated spreadsheets with the original drafts from a month ago. She shook her head and smiled. "I can't believe how much this has changed. How much I've changed." "You didn't change," I told her. "You just stopped letting other people decide what you could do." That night, lying in bed, I thought about the word legacy. For years, I believed mine would be a house, some investments, maybe a few family heirlooms. But the truth was sitting in my living room earlier that evening. Legacy wasn't what you left behind. It was what you passed on in the present. And what I was passing on now was something no one could strip away: independence, self-respect, and the ability to stand firmly in your own decisions. The world will always have opinions about what you can or can't do, especially when you're older. Especially when you're a woman. But the final say is yours. It always has been. If you've ever been told you're too old, too set in your ways, or too fragile to decide for yourself, I'd love to hear your story. Share how you proved them wrong, and maybe together we can remind a few more people that our worth doesn't come with an expiration date.